Hey guys, welcome back. We have another episode and another guest with you this evening. So this evening we are chatting to Carly Whitaker. So Carly and I met briefly while I was studying at the Open Window Institute a couple of years ago, but our paths crossed quite a bit. At the time, just after I left Open Window, Carly, you became head of school, and then we saw each other quite a few times due to a friend of mine, Sydney, who was a gallery curator and manager. And I think you were actually also exhibiting a piece one evening, if I'm not incorrect. So we kept on seeing each other quite a bit at some of the events. But tonight we're going to be talking more about Carly's background, which in particular is very focused on the educational spectrum, or rather the educational industry. She's been a lecturer at Flip. I mean, in my opinion, almost at every university and every institution in this country, which I think is going to be an interesting conversation because of both private and public institutions, which is going to be interesting conversation. But now I find it even more interesting because I see you are actually no longer lecturing or being an active educator, but you're rather now the head of digital product design for a company or organization that does education within the employment space. So it's still like education, but you're no longer like an active educator. Very interesting, but welcome.
Thank you. That was a great introduction, Stephanie. Thank you so much.
Curtsy.
Nice.
Yeah, I think it's really going to be an amazing conversation. I think especially, and I'm sure Steph expects this, especially because of the space I'm trying to get into. I'm really excited to dive into this conversation because I'm super passionate about education and learning in general.
Yeah.
And so maybe let's start by rolling the clock back a little bit, just to get an understanding of where kind of like the roots started with you. Like where were you trained, or what was that journey like roughly? We don't have to make that too long if you don't want to. But then also just focusing, I think, specifically on how you sort of ended up where you are right now. What were some of the key milestones along the way?
Okay, awesome. Please feel free to interrupt me and ask questions if I'm leaving stuff out because, you know, I'm old and my memory's patchy. Jokes. So I studied fine arts after high school. And during my degree, I did a couple of digital art courses the one was specifically on using the internet as a medium and a tool, but mostly as a medium for an artistic practice. And then the other one was on, okay, now I'm going to show my age. It was like in 2007 on like using social networks as also a platform for like creating an artistic practice. So like the introduction of like the digital medium to me was really new then as a space for creative expression and exploration. And that's kind of when I fell in love with it, specifically the internet. And then a couple of years later, I went on to do my master's in digital interactive media. And that's kind of where I got introduced to interaction design. And then from there, I started moving between the education space, so lecturing, once I'd finished my master's, developing my own artistic practice as an artist, and then also as a curator, so a curatorial practice as well.
Cool.
So kind of like exploring the different options and seeing like how my practice as a whole could develop within these different areas. So I think lecturing gave me the opportunity to continue to learn as well after my master's, but also to practice in a different way and to learn from the students as well, because that's a lot of what happens while you're lecturing.
Wow.
So then I moved from, like, as Stephanie said, many institutions, and then I found myself sort of moving more towards the private higher education space at Open Window, and continuing to develop my artistic practice and curatorial practice while I was there. And then I started my PhD just before the pandemic. And then sort of halfway through that first year, I moved to an organization called Umuzi. And we do tech and design learnerships and micro-credentials and facilitation. within the tech and design space. And yes, I was head of digital product design there for a while, and I haven't updated my LinkedIn profile, which I totally should, because now I'm head of culture and brand there. So working very closely with brand. Yeah. So, and I've sort of almost so close been finishing up my PhD this year.
Sure. Wow. What a journey. Sorry for my naivety. I actually never realized that you were a full practicing fine artist throughout the time I knew you. It was actually just that small glimpse. I remember seeing a piece hanging in the No End Gallery space.
Awesome.
And I didn't know if that was a once-off thing or if that was actually, something you did full-time throughout your journey up until today. But it's also very interesting because I don't know a lot of people, because you actually, correct me if I'm wrong, I remember your experience with interaction design and digital design is very much informing your process and your output as a fine artist, correct?
So I think it absolutely has. It absolutely has. I think my exposure to different methodologies and different design approaches and ways of thinking and ways of researching has 100% informed my artistic and curatorial practice, and as a result, my PhD. But I think, and the other way around, like the creative practice has informed the way in which I approach lecturing and the way in which I approach teaching and facilitating and mentoring as well. And the way in which I would approach a project just in general.
Sure. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I'm quite intrigued how you say vice versa.
I think a creative practice has almost no limitations often. And I think what the digital space has afforded me is limitations and constraints within my own practice. So I think that's why I love the internet so much, because it's just the internet, it's just that space, but it's also so much within that space. It's so broad, and it could be so much within an artistic practice. I think understanding, initially I learned how to code a website and how to develop a website, but then I moved towards, okay, cool, now we have to design this. Designing and UX obviously plays a huge role. So having all of these tools informs how you would approach building a website as an artwork, or building a interactive online installation as an artwork. And I mean, they're all things that need to be usable. Designing an experience is something that needs to be considered, but a creative practice allows for more movement within that space sometimes. So I think that's quite nice. Whereas often when you're working in a more corporate agency space within designing a product, the constraints are very specific, focused on your client, it's very, the parameters are very tightly often delineated for you. But within a creative practice, there's a little bit more freedom there, but within those limitations as well. I don't know if that sort of answers or expands a little bit on it more. But I think, so allowing myself to use those constraints of a research process has enabled my artistic practice to move in certain directions. But then also, so leveraging off of both, leaning more into a creative and open space and allowing for more moments of what if versus it being a little bit more rigid and structured as it would. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's very interesting, and I think we'll dive into that topic a little bit more. But there are a couple of sort of conflicts that I'd like us to dive into, or tensions, because I think one of the things that's really interesting about you is it seems like very often you sit on both sides of the fence. If I think about the curator and the artist, those are typically two people who are kind of working.
Student.
In a sense, they're collaborating, but they're also negotiating. Is this piece going to make it into this release, or is it going to maybe need to wait for a different exhibition or so on? And then on the artist side, it's making sure that your art stays true to who you are. So those, in some sense, can be a conflicting element. But then if you also look at it from the lecturer and the practitioner side, it's also that same sort of tension or conflict, or kind of being on both sides of the camp. So can we maybe start a little bit by talking about how you experienced both sides from the perspective of practicing art and curating? Like, what are some of your thoughts around that?
Sure. So this is quite interesting because this is a lot of what my recent research has been like trying to unpack, I think. For so many years.
We're going to pretend to know that.
just go, yes.
We read all about it.
We went way back into your Instagram feed and looked at everything. Because there are all these different fields or areas of interest, so often it was very difficult for me to describe what I was or what I did. Like when someone said to you, oh, what do you do? I'm like, oh, I'm an artist, I'm a lecturer, I'm a curator, I'm a researcher, I'm a designer, I'm there's a whole long list of things. So I think this idea of a hyphenated role is something which is very appealing. I mean, and recently it's become quite popular thanks to Pharrell moving into his role. So I think the tension between the artist and the curator is something that I used to think about quite a lot, and whether I could be both, and whether I was a curator or whether I was just someone who organized things, because it often felt like that. But what was more and more interesting to me was the way in which I used curatorial practices within my artistic practice because of the digital medium. So working online, whether it was creating a blog on Tumblr, and within that space the act of curating is enhanced by the digital medium, selecting the different images that you want to reblog, that you want to post, their layout in relation to each other. All of that is curating. And the digital medium allows for it to happen so easily. And I know the curatorial and the curating is such a very trendy word and has been for a while, but as an artist, the digital medium allows you to do that so easily and so naturally that you have to constantly think of yourself when generating work as that. And sometimes you don't even know you're doing it in a way. So I think when I started to move more into an official curatorial role, the skills that I already had were enhanced because of that. So moving into that role meant that it was easier for me to work with artists because I understood what was happening in their artistic practice and working with them versus that tension that you described. It wasn't productive, and seeing it more as a collaboration and, not placing myself as the curator at the center or as a hierarchy. It was very much when it's all in the same line. I don't have words tonight. Or no, it was the same level. There was no hierarchy. It was really about opening up space. So it wasn't the tension didn't exist then because of the opportunities that were happening and the opening up of space as a result of the curating and the exhibitions that I was working in.
Yeah, and what you're describing kind of brought something to mind or surfaced the thought. Is almost like what you were describing for a while. It sounded to me like you were talking about the curator's role, and then you were speaking a little bit more actually about the creative process. And it kind of makes me think that in a sense, creative expression is a process of curation, but just curating the ideas in your head and then expressing them. So in a sense, it's a completely different space and it's got different rules by which you curate, but I think there's at least a similar ethic. And I think when that's forgotten, that's where you get the negative conflict, where you get the artist and the curator maybe butting heads a little bit. And then now stepping maybe... Go for it, please.
I think it also depends on the context that you're curating within and that you're making within. So often the context and the audience play a huge role in informing how that happens and how that unfolds as well. So there's a lot of similarity between that and design and product design and how you would approach things from that perspective.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely true. And then maybe looking a little bit more on the practitioner versus educator side, I think that's also very interesting. Sort of two camps to be in, especially doing them at the same time. How have you kind of like found that, or how is the one side informed the other?
I think in quite a similar way to like the artist curator thing, a dynamic or role, in that it's necessary for it to be dynamic. It's necessary for you to be able to move between them, and helpful. You know, I don't think you can practice. I don't think you can educate without practicing. It's such a. Sometimes it's obviously hard to, because you're educating and there's so much labor involved in that. Yeah. But it's important for your educational practice, for your approach and the way in which you grow and the way in which your students or learners grow is necessary and will inevitably be informed by your own practice. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, I think that's amazing, and it's like it's good to hear that from somebody like you, because I think for a lot of people they don't get the chance to be in both sides of the camp, and even if they do, it's rare that they get to be that at the same time. And so I guess maybe it might be interesting to hear a little bit. You know, we've kind of walked through a little bit of your background, and we've walked through a little bit of the ideas that are sort of floating around your head at the moment. Can we maybe dive in specifically? I don't know how specific you can get at this point in time, but a little bit more about your research and the work that you're doing in that space. And then I think from there we can talk a little bit more about what's occupying you professionally right now.
Sure. So my research is on what are the different ways that you can open up space and make space, and encourage or facilitate or make space for discourse and creative practice within the digital arts in South Africa as part of a bigger context of the global South and majority world. So those are kind of the areas that I've been looking at. It's a practice-based PhD, which means that my practice that I've been doing throughout the research throughout the PhD is the research.
Interesting.
And that gets read alongside a thesis. Study as well. Yes. So looking at my own practice, as you know, I've got as like case studies or as leading to certain outcomes which constitute as research within this field. So like I've got 4 different projects that I ran or was involved in or was part of that I unpack, and they are all sort of parts of different components, and I play slightly different roles in each project, which all sort of form an ecosystem within the digital art space that hopefully enable it to be sustainable. And it's through different types of spaces, like a residency program, an exhibition or display space, a studio space, and an exhibition space, that can happen, that it's only through these spaces that artists have the opportunity and have the space to develop a practice, iterate a practice, display a practice, and form a network. So I'm looking at a particular methodology called a curatorial network methodology, which I started writing about a couple of years ago. And this way of working is this networked collaboration that sees the artist curator as something that the role is dynamic, and it is either through the network that the curating and the curatorial occurs, both within the connections between the people involved in the project and the way in which the project exists, but also through the medium, and that being a result of the digital medium. So it's not that a network curatorial methodology is exclusive to a digital medium, but the digital medium facilitates that. It can definitely exist outside of that space, but it's sort of like prime for it to occur and for it to exist. I hope I did that justice
cool.
because I haven't spoken about it in a couple weeks. Every now and then I have to be like, what did I do? What did I do? Okay, yeah. That's what I did. Don't lose the words.
Only a couple of years worth of work that you need to condense into one singular sentence, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I would be curious though if you can give us an example that would not be yourself. I'm trying to see if we can dumb it down a little bit for people who are not too familiar with all this lingo. If you had to take an example of someone else and run it through this process and ecosystem that you were just describing us, and what, like a more tangible example, what informs which relationship and network.
So I think, I don't know if I can give you another example, but I can maybe speak to one of the projects.
Illustrated,
Yeah.
That showcases this. So the original project, the first project that I started is called Floating Reverie, and it's a digital residency program. And it consists of two components. The first one is a residency program called 2 weeks. And the other component is a post-digital instance, which is like an exhibition. So the 2 weeks residency happens once a month in theory, where artists are invited to participate in the residency. And it's an online residency. This isn't the online component. And they are invited for 2 weeks to do the same thing every day. So iterate the same concept, the same idea, or the same practice every day online on a platform of their choice. So they could post the same image or the same type of image or the same concept, whether it was on Instagram or on Tumblr, or the same sound or the same process of exploring sound on SoundCloud, or they could make their own website. So I've had a lot of artists do that. So the one artist, this is quite a nice example, his name is Daniel Rautenbach, and he built his own website. Now I'm going to forget the name. I think it was called the Content Generation or something. Anyway, it was a curatorial generator where he put in the name and the medium and the type of artwork. And then so he created that as a piece of code. And then every day he would generate a new format. So a title, a medium, and a space that it would exist in. And then he would create that artwork. So by the end of the 14 days, he had 14 different types of artworks that were essentially a curated exhibition based off of this code. So this idea of iterating a concept and an idea and a research and a piece of research every day as part of a residency, which is an opportunity for an artist to cultivate an idea. And in a way, it sort of becomes a mini studio practice for them. And then the post-digital instance happens at the end of the year, where artists are invited back to reimagine what their residency was in a physical space. So that happens in a physical context. So there's a relationship between the digital residency that they did, which happens online, and then the physical one that they did. And so Daniel did I don't know, it's like an illustrated animation, a video essay, basically, responding to this idea of content generation and AI and machine learning and those types of things. And then, so we displayed that and installed that in a very specific way in the post-digital for him. So that's an example of how Floating Reverie works. And then when I started it, what I became really aware of was that I used my immediate network first to curate the residency. So that first year was a lot of people that I was at university with or who I knew in the art world, whose practice lent itself to Floating Reverie. But that was only going to go so far. Yeah. So what I asked artists was in their post-residency interview is I asked them to recommend an artist whose practice they thought resonated with Floating Reverie. And then the Floating Reverie's network itself expanded. And that became really interesting in terms of how that network grew. So that's really where the network for Floating Reverie exists, not just in the medium in terms of the residency being online, and the residency being a network, but also within each artist residency itself, those 14 days become a little network of meaning and moments for the artist within their practice. But then Floating Reverie, as it expanded, became a network as well. And that became something that artists could leverage or reciprocate within as well.
So the artists that participate in the residency, they during the 14 days, do they also get to engage and interact with the other artists in the residency? Or what is the type
so
of
there's only
engagement?
one artist at a time. So there isn't necessarily specific engagement. If they wanted, there could be. I've had instances where artists respond to someone else's residency that's happened, and that's quite an interesting moment. Yeah, so I think it just depends.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense, and I really like a lot of what you're talking about, and for me especially the cascading network element. That for me is what's really interesting, because I think that like creating the space for people to express themselves is valuable and it's useful, especially for that person. But the problem with it, like many good things relating to people, is they're not scalable, because people and their time is not scalable. And so, you know, when you start to look at something like this that can have a network effect, that's as close to scaling as we've managed to get with these high touch type of experiences. And so I think it's very interesting to see where something like this will sort of evolve. So I want us to do a quick exercise. And I'm going to ask you the question,
Of course, jumping
and then
jacks.
I'm going to no, not physical exercise, don't worry.
Are we playing a game? Yay!
So
We're in Alfie's room now.
Exactly. You're in my little play space. But what I'd like to do is, so in a sense, the question is, post the PhD, where do you see this going? And I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting, because there are a couple of things that you mentioned that I think are really
Alfie,
valuable.
of all the questions you ask a PhD student,
Oh, shame. Joking about tomorrow.
the first question you don't ask is, what is your PhD on? The second question is, what next? Jokes.
This is I'm breaking all the rules today then. But
Where's the set of rules so we know what to do after this question?
exactly. You can just use that as a
Want to hit
script.
them all. I'll ask ChatGPT while we're busy.
Yeah.
But you know, I think, and one of the reasons that I'm asking you this question is because you are in the educational space, and I think that's a space that has been ignored by innovation for long enough. And when I hear about projects like this, it gets me excited, and I think it gets other people excited, because I think everybody has this feeling that what we have isn't good enough. It's like, even though we're happy to say, like, we're willing to send our kids to school as it exists today, and we're happy to kind of see, and you know, it's not even a matter of the teachers being at fault or the schools being at fault. It's literally just the society and the system that we live in. There are certain elements, from teachers not necessarily having enough support to students not having access to the actual learning material. There are all of these problems that make any thinking person realize that this is an industry that needs help. It's an industry that needs support, and it's an industry that needs top minds to be focused on. And so I'm not at all trying to get into the practicalities of what you're doing. I think what I'd like you maybe to speak about more is the change that you'd like to effect. Like, what is the thing that drove you to this space? What is, what's driving you?
Yeah.
The beautiful vision that you might or might not attain.
So I think, so from an artistic and curatorial practice perspective, I think the reason I started Floating Reverie and went into the other three projects that I write about in my PhD, and that are part of my practice, they're Covalence, Tomorrow, the gallery space that was in at Keys in Rosebank, and then the fourth one is Blue Ocean, which is a new project that I've started. And the reason I moved into those projects or initiated them or was invited to participate was because when I left my master's, which I was very fortunate to be able to do, didn't know what to do next in terms of developing my own practice, and wanted to make art and show my work. But there were very limited spaces at that point in Johannesburg. So the moment for making a space became very clear to me that was what not just I needed, but what other contemporary artists in my position also needed, and absolutely contemporary artists who wanted to practice within the digital space needed. So that's why I started it. So it was out of identifying a need and knowing that it wouldn't necessarily solve it, but through a little bit of initiative and effort, that could potentially provide a platform for a lot of other people to participate in. And I think that's been incredible to see. I think, and a lot of the other projects have come about in that same way. They are responses to either one of my previous projects or responses to the context that they emerge in. So Blue Ocean, which is an online gallery space, an exhibition and art space, is a response to Floating Reverie in a way, because when I was doing Floating Reverie, I realized, well, we've got all these artists who want to practice online. It would be amazing if they just had an online space. So Floating Reverie acts as a residency space, but it's not a display space of the, it's just a process or residency space. So Blue Ocean acts as a display opportunity and a presentation of the artwork online, or a possibility for that to happen. So there was another part to your question that I wanted to speak about. Oh, my passion. Yeah. Oh, and what next? Yeah. So that's very, very important to me as part of my practice. And then maybe this segues quite nicely to my sort of professional practice, which is now sort of moved more from education, more where I work at Umuzi, which is still about continuing to open up a space. And even though I'm no longer facilitating or lecturing, it's absolutely supporting that movement in that direction and enabling people, specifically in South Africa and in Africa, to have access to education and to increase their skill development within the design and tech space. So there's an absolute connection there, and about placing power in the hands of the person who's making things and facilitating that, whether it's an exhibition space or whether it's skills. I think for me, they go hand in hand.
I'm quite curious, as someone who's also a curator, what that experience has been like as Blue Water, for instance. Curating a space, a physical space, I'm assuming here, is a lot different than curating a digital experience, because the way someone moves through a physical space and engages with pieces around them is a lot different than in the web space. Can you tell a little bit about that experience? Have you curated digital spaces before or displays?
So I haven't done like a digital physical space, if that makes sense. Like I haven't done a 3D environment room curating. I haven't done that. So for Blue Ocean, it's mostly been, so we've just had one exhibition so far, but it's about treating the physical, the digital space as the space that you interact with through the exhibition. So using the medium to enable
experience.
You to view the artwork.
So it's all part of
the same way you would approach a website. It's the same way that, like, designing and the UX of a website, it would, that's how I would that's how I've tried to approach curating a digital exhibition.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that is important, because the 3D element and all that is cool and it's flashy and all of that, but it's not necessarily it may not necessarily be the native form of expression that specific medium requires or deserves. But I think that's in some ways a question for another day, because there's something else that I'd like to dive into a little bit more, and it's you've spoken a lot about this idea of sort of creating spaces, and it seems like it's been a consistent narrative as you've kind of been evolving through like these different spaces that you've been playing in. Can you maybe talk a little bit towards the decision to actually officially once and for all kind of end the lecturer side of things and step into the professional space? Because I think we kind of, hopped over that, but I think something like that in some ways is not to make a mountain over a molehill, but it's really like changing your identity in a certain way, or at least a part of your identity. So can you just talk a little bit about like what that transition was like for you?
I don't think it was as big a, like the transition, I don't think it was as big a thing for me as the way you're explaining it. And I mean, when you describe it and explain it, it makes sense, but I don't think it shook me the way that you would have expected. I think maybe it was because of the pandemic. We were already shook enough.
Fair enough.
So I think it was like, cool, that's fine. I think what I do miss about the lecturing is I miss the postgraduate component. And I think there have been a couple moments since then that I've been exposed to it. But I think maybe because of my own research, I still received that enjoyment or had the opportunity to have that still in my life. And because I also have written a couple of articles since then and was still practicing as an academic in a way. I didn't lose out on that way of thinking. It was maybe more focused on my own practice and less on like the development or growth of a student's practice or a student's knowledge. But it felt like an inevitable, not inevitable. It felt like normal.
It felt like the natural next step.
Cool, now I'm moving into this space. And I think when I started at Umuzi, I still was like more mentoring learners there. So it wasn't like a hard, clean break. So maybe that's also why it doesn't feel like it was a big transition. So I was facilitating there. I was developing content and still doing that type of work. And then that sort of, I transitioned out of that there.
Okay,
so,
okay. And do you think you'll ever go back?
Yeah.
Like to academia and teaching and so on? Or is that a question left for another day?
I think anything is possible. Anything is possible. And given the right moment, anything could happen. I don't think it's something necessarily that I'm actively pursuing at the moment, but I think time will tell.
I'm also quite curious, your role at Umuzi and the previous role, which was the head of product more, how all your previous experiences kind of informed what you're doing there now, because now you also move to people and culture, but it's also still an organization that facilitates education, which is something you're very passionate about, something you have a lot of experience around. So I'm curious to see how your lecturing background and your mentoring and skill educational background is kind of informing developing a specific culture for an organization that is geared and created around education.
I think, it is an interesting move, definitely, or growth. I think it's got to do, I think, at the heart of everything that I've ever done.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's the opening up space, it's the making space, it's the facilitation, but it's the passion for the digital medium. It's the absolute passion for it within a South African and African context. And within a global South majority world context. So understanding what that means for us to practice within the space and share that perspective and share that knowledge. And I think as a brand, Umuzi, and as an organization, that is 100% aligned with that. And I think that that's why that my transition in my different roles has felt quite natural and felt needed within the organization for this space to be something that grows, whether it's me or with other people and through other people and with my team. I think that it's crucial that there's always that lens that's brought into everything.
No, now that you explained it, actually, it makes so much sense. Like all the dots are connecting because you've been the ambassador, the embodiment of someone carrying that culture and, you know, carrying that through your journey. So now being that representative and the person that actually intentionally creating that space and that narrative does make a lot of sense, and how that was such a natural progression for you in the space that you're in with Umuzi.
Yeah.
And Umuzi is an incredible organization. The impact on learners' lives and the community that we have, the alumni community we have, the partners we work with, the scope and the potential that it has is just incredible. And it's a wonderful, wonderful space to be involved in and contribute to, and know that you are making a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, no, definitely. Maybe, I think especially because I'm somewhat familiar with Umuzi, it might be worthwhile for us to just sort of imagine we've never heard of it before, and just very briefly talk a little bit about what a person might expect if they engage with you. Who are the type of people that you look to work with? What do you try to help them do?
Sure. So I think we've expanded and grown so much since the pandemic, and I think that's an incredible story within itself. There were many moments at the beginning of the pandemic, I think, where, like many companies and organizations, we weren't sure what was going to happen and the direction we were going to move in. We started off predominantly offering learnerships within the tech and design space, but also in other spaces. But we've predominantly stayed within those two spaces. So I headed up the digital product design offering, so UI, UX, business analysis. We also had an offering in copywriting and a couple of other different fields, but those first three are our sort of majority. And then there's a lot of different tech offerings and development offerings that we have within the learnership space as well, like web dev and data science. So, you know, it's an incredible space to work in. We've moved recently into micro-credentials, so working with Grow with Google and Meta to offer their courses, and partnering with organizations like UNICEF to facilitate really big projects and access to those different micro-credentials and training for learners across Africa. So the impact is quite big and vast that we have on learners, and the relationships we develop with learners and with our alumni are incredible, and the way they connect with us is extremely valuable and visible.
I was actually just about to ask about that relationship and how intimate it is, because I can imagine as someone coming from you were at Wits, UJ, UP, and then Open Window, which is like a very small group of students that you have for quite a long time, or you, at least the relationship is very long compared to a learnership. And it's also not in a physical space, and it's very short. How has that been? Yeah,
because we are fully remote. So I think within the learnership space, it is short. It's 9. They're with us for 9 months, and then they're with us. Then they go to work experience for 3 months. So I think the difference though with like university and with the way in which we work at Umuzi is that we approach this very much from a real world context and treat the learners as though they, this is their workspace and they come to learn, but it's very much a workspace and project-based learning, which is crucial. So they're doing this every day, which is super intense, but super beneficial for their growth within the learnership space. Within the micro-credential space, it's guided and facilitated through the courses that we offer. But there is also, it's a much lighter sort of touch model, but still definitely aspects of what we have within the learnership, which is this personal connection, and we do encourage that. We have different parts of our organization. We have an incredible learner experience team and delivery team who work very closely with the learners. We have the managers and facilitators who work very closely with the learners as well, facilitating them through the courses and through different programs at the different components. So even though it's not like you were describing, Steph, as the way it is at university, there still is that incredible connection and relationship that is formed, and mentorship that happens within our space. And I think, it's through that mentorship that incredible growth can happen, and within someone's skill set and the way in which they approach things. And it's the hard skills, but it's also the soft skills and the professional skills. It's the presenting, it's the communication, it's all those really important things that are so valuable to learn, so that when you do go into workspace, you're not like completely intimidated and overwhelmed by things. For which it can be for many, many, many young people. I guess, if you're part of anyone's growth journey, or if any individual experiences some type of change internally in themselves and you are actively involved in that immediately makes and gives you such a, not intimate, but to some level intimate connection to that person. Because it's not necessarily a vulnerable space when you're growing, but it's a very much self-inquiry, self-involved, self-reflective space. And being a third party that's stepping into this very sacred space almost, where someone is learning and developing in such a exponential way in such a short given time, it is a very special relationship that I guess you will develop with them, even if the setting, the environment and the engagement looks a little bit different to what you've previously experienced. Definitely. And it is vulnerable. It is vulnerable for everybody involved, for all parties. And knowing that you're not just impacting this individual, whether it is within the learnership or within the micro-credential, because there are some incredible stories across the spectrum of what we offer. Knowing that you're not just impacting them, that it's the impact beyond them, that it's the impact within their communities that you are not part of, but you are enabling. And I think that's the bigger impact. That's the real special message about what it is that we do.
So I think we're sort of rolling around to the closing stages of this discussion. But maybe before we step into that space, could you tell us, so if, for example, I was a person interested in engaging with Umuzi, or kind of like connecting, like what should that look like? Is there something specific somewhere specific I should go? Are there things that I need? Who is the typical person?
If you're a potential learner, or if you just want to do some cool stuff with us.
Both, I guess.
Or you want to partner with us. Which? Nice. So, obviously follow us on all our social media channels. We're constantly posting new updates and new opportunities that we have. And then if you're interested in applying for any of our programs, all the information's on our website. If you want to partner with us, if you want to do some cool stuff with us, you please email me. It's carly.whitaker@umuzi.org. So definitely pop me a message and we'll see what we can do if you're interested in anything. Yeah.
Amazing. So just a recap on the socials, that's umuzi.org. And for the website, umuzi.org, but we'll put that in the show notes just to make sure that everybody who's will have access. And it's always difficult remembering all of the handles and stuff.
Yeah.
I know.
But
obviously.
We'll do that. And I think it'll be great for people to reach out. I think especially for people, if you're in the space that you kind of need that support, and you need that kind of like just step to get you between where you are now and to your next space, I definitely recommend it. I've been a far off viewer of Umuzi for quite a number of years now, and like you guys have been doing quite a lot of really good work, so I can definitely recommend.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we've got a couple of extremely exciting projects on the go within the culture and brand space. We run a series of talks called Beyond Umuzi, where we invite people from a range of different industries, alumni, and just general like rad people to come and talk with our community and share their life lessons and learnings and stories and fun facts.
I was about to say, kind of like what we're doing with you.
Kind of like this. So maybe I'll reciprocate. It's all about the network. Yeah, so there's so many opportunities to get involved with us, and so definitely pop me a message, and I'd love to collaborate.
Amazing.
Always good to hear that.
Carly? Carly, thank you so much for your time. It really has been a blast in this conversation. I think this is the most I've laughed in a single episode. So
mostly before we pressed record.
Yay!
You don't need to know about all that.
Now they're going to feel left out, like they missed something.
They did miss something. Maybe they should have been here with us.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Alfie. Thanks so much for inviting me.
I have one last question. Are you exhibiting any works or curating any spaces that anyone that's in the Gauteng region can look out for?
I am unfortunately
You've
not.
been preoccupied.
No, not at the moment. I've been a little busy getting wrapping that up. But hopefully towards the end of the year, I will definitely be doing some cool new projects. So follow me on my Instagram as well if you want. Yeah, and I'm sure I'll post something there. But would love to do something by the end of the year.
Amazing.
Yeah, keep an eye out for it. And very, very best of luck closing off this exciting, exhilarating chapter that you are in. I'm not going to ask you what is next, but we will be looking out for what is next.
Cool. Me too.
And to everyone listening, thank you very much for your time. It's been good having you, and have a good day.
See you soon.
Until next time.